Why do the brands that claim to hate advertising always seem to spend the most money reinventing it? Why does "we're not like other companies" somehow require a full creative team, a content calendar, influencer contracts, and a budget big enough to buy a Super Bowl slot? Somewhere along the way, anti-marketing stopped being a joke and became a weapon. Irony that sells, confession that converts, and honesty engineered like a product feature. Stay till the end, because once you see how the loudest rejection of advertising became the most expensive ad of all, you'll never hear "this isn't an ad" the same way again. Anti-marketing didn't appear out of nowhere. It grew inside a generation that learned to distrust advertising almost instinctively. Banner ads were blocked, TV commercials were skipped, influencer promotions were met with eye rolls instead of excitement. Traditional advertising stopped feeling persuasive and started feeling embarrassing. In that environment, brands didn't disappear. They adapted by repositioning themselves as victims of advertising itself. Suddenly, companies began speaking the language of resistance. They claimed to hate ads. They apologized for showing up in your feed. They admitted advertising was annoying, awkward, outdated. And by doing that, they reframed themselves not as corporations trying to sell something, but as allies trapped inside the same broken system as the audience. Media outlets helped build this image, describing these brands as self-aware, refreshingly honest, and perfectly tuned to internet culture. Advertising wasn't presented as marketing anymore, it was framed as cultural commentary. This public image was carefully constructed. Brands were no longer distant entities with slogans and logos. They became personalities. They spoke like people who understood meme sarcasm and collective exhaustion. Press coverage treated campaigns as clever social moments, not commercial strategies. Headlines focused on tone rather than intent. The story wasn't that a company sold a product. It was that a company got the joke. Visually, the shift was immediate and unmistakable. Anti-marketing campaigns stopped looking like ads and started looking like everyday content. Shaky handheld footage replaced polished camera work. Imperfect lighting replaced studio gloss. Videos felt improvised, as if they were recorded on impulse rather than planned weeks in advance. Logos appeared late, briefly, sometimes almost apologetically. Product shots were casual, nearly dismissive. The aesthetic said one thing very clearly: we're not trying too hard. Talk shows and interviews reinforced the same tone. Brand representatives weren't invited to pitch products. They were invited to talk about culture, internet humor, or why advertising feels broken. The language was conversational, ironic, disarming. Selling was never acknowledged directly. Instead, the product was positioned as a byproduct of honesty rather than its goal. On social media, anti-marketing blended seamlessly into meme culture. Brands mocked themselves openly. They joked about selling out. They posted captions like "sorry for the ad" or "we hate this too." Comment sections filled with praise: "this brand is different, at least they're honest, this doesn't even feel like an ad." Media outlets quoted those reactions as proof of authenticity, reinforcing the idea that something fundamentally new was happening. But this is where the surface begins to crack, because the casualness wasn't accidental. The imperfection was designed, the jokes were tested, the self-deprecation was approved. Every offhand moment passed through legal teams, brand strategists, and analytics dashboards. Looking effortless required enormous effort. Looking honest required precision. Anti-marketing didn't remove the machinery of advertising, it buried it under aesthetics. There's an irony that's impossible to ignore. The brands that claim to hate advertising the most are often the ones that talk about themselves the loudest. They don't withdraw from attention, they dominate it differently. Traditional ads interrupt you for 30 seconds. Anti-marketing occupies your attention because you believe you chose it. And that belief is the key. When persuasion looks like entertainment, resistance drops. When selling feels like shared humor, skepticism disappears. When brands frame themselves as fellow critics of advertising, they inherit your distrust and redirect it away from themselves. This is the surface illusion. Anti-marketing depends on familiarity, without friction influence, without pressure persuasion, disguised as alignment. Nothing looks aggressive, nothing feels corporate, everything seems culturally fluent, ironic safe. But surfaces exist to conceal structure, and while this layer feels lighter, friendlier, more honest, it's only effective because it hides a deeper strategy, one designed not to convince you loudly but to make convincing you unnecessary. Because if you believe you aren't being advertised to, then advertising has already succeeded. Over time, anti-marketing stopped being just a style and became a story brands told about themselves. A myth formed, one where the company wasn't a seller, but a truth teller. Not a corporation, but a voice. Not a marketer, but a critic of marketing who just happened to have a product on the side. This myth is built from repeated PR narratives that sound noble on the surface. We're just being honest. We don't believe in traditional advertising. We want to have real conversations. These lines appear again and again in interviews, campaign statements, and press releases. They're framed as values rather than tactics. Advertising isn't something the brand does, it's something the brand reluctantly survives. Campaigns are described as experiments, statements, or cultural moments. The product becomes secondary to the message. Media coverage echoes this framing, praising brands for their courage, their transparency, their willingness to break the rules. The myth grows stronger with every headline that treats a campaign like commentary instead of commerce. Quotes are carefully selected to reinforce moral distance. Executives talk about how much they dislike ads. Influencers joke about hating sponsorships. Brands insist they'd rather not sell anything at all if only the system didn't force them to. The implication is subtle but powerful. We are trapped in capitalism with you. And if we're all trapped together, then selling stops feeling adversarial. Sarcasm becomes the dominant tone. Ads mock ads. Campaigns parody campaigns. The brand positions itself as self-aware enough to be harmless. This irony functions like a safety net. If someone criticizes the campaign, the brand can respond with humor. We know it's an ad. That's the joke. Critique dissolves into misunderstanding. Anyone who pushes back looks humorless, out of touch, or unable to read the room. Metaphorically, anti-marketing brands dress like rebels while owning the factory. They speak the language of outsiders while operating from the center of power. They sell dissent, prepackaged rebellion in controlled doses, authenticity with a purchase link attached. The myth says they're different, but the structure underneath is unchanged. The brilliance of the myth lies in how it reassigns roles. The brand isn't persuading you, it's inviting you. You're not being influenced, you're choosing. The act of buying becomes a statement about identity rather than consumption. You're not purchasing a product, you're aligning with a worldview. And once that alignment exists, the brand no longer has to sell aggressively. Loyalty replaces persuasion. Trust replaces skepticism. The myth does the work that advertising used to do openly. It doesn't convince you that the product is good. It convinces you that you are the kind of person who would choose it. This myth is reinforced socially. Fans defend the brand online not as customers, but as insiders. Criticism is met with explanations, not arguments. You don't get it. They're not like other companies. The myth spreads peer-to-peer, which makes it feel organic even when it isn't. At this stage, the brand has achieved something traditional advertising always struggled with. It has turned persuasion into participation, selling into signaling, commerce into culture. But myths don't exist to reveal truth. They exist to protect strategy. And the longer this myth holds, the longer brands are seen as honest critics of advertising rather than its most evolved practitioners, the harder it becomes to notice how much influence is being exercised quietly, comfortably, without resistance. Because when advertising convinces you it isn't advertising anymore, it doesn't disappear. It becomes invisible. Once you move past the myth, the contradictions become impossible to ignore. Anti-marketing brands don't just dislike advertising, they spend extraordinary amounts of money perfecting new ways to do it. Campaigns that claim to be low effort involve months of planning, creative agencies, influencer contracts, data modeling, and legal review. The casual tone is expensive. The irony is engineered. Authenticity, it turns out, has a budget. Here's the first detail most people miss. Anti-marketing doesn't reduce advertising spend, it reallocates it. Instead of paying for obvious placement brands, invest in cultural camouflage. Money shifts from airtime to storytelling, from slogans to sentiment, from persuasion to positioning. The question isn't, are they advertising? It's how deeply is the advertising embedded? Consider how often these campaigns rely on influencers who complain about advertising itself. A creator jokes about hating sponsorships, rolls their eyes at capitalism, and then seamlessly introduces the product. That moment feels honest, but it's carefully calibrated. Contracts specify tone. Talking points are approved. Disclosure is minimized but compliant. The reluctance is part of the script. And what happens when criticism appears? This is where anti-marketing becomes especially effective. If a traditional ad is criticized, the brand must defend claims. If an anti-marketing campaign is criticized, the brand deflects with humor. Relax, it's a joke. We already said it's an ad. Accountability dissolves into irony. The brand never has to answer whether the product is good, only whether the audience got it. Here's the second detail few people notice. Anti-marketing shifts responsibility onto the consumer. Traditional ads push. Anti-marketing nudges. Instead of telling you to buy it, creates an environment where buying feels like your idea. If the product disappoints, the blame doesn't fall on the brand, it falls on your judgment. You chose this. That psychological transfer is crucial. It protects the brand from backlash while preserving loyalty. Timing matters too. Anti-marketing thrives in moments of collective cynicism. When audiences distrust institutions, irony becomes currency. Brands exploit that distrust by positioning themselves as fellow skeptics. We don't trust ads either. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Distrust doesn't weaken advertising, it refines it. The more skeptical audiences become, the more valuable subtle persuasion gets. Look at the outcomes. Brands using anti-marketing often experience higher engagement, stronger brand affinity, and longer retention. Why? Because they aren't just selling products, they're selling identity. The purchase isn't framed as consumption, but as participation in a shared cultural stance. You aren't buying soap, you're rejecting fake marketing. You aren't buying software, you're supporting honesty. The product becomes proof of values rather than utility. But what happens when the cameras turn off? Behind the scenes, these brands behave exactly like the corporations they mock. They track conversion obsessively. They A/B test irony. They optimize vulnerability. Every laugh, every pause, every unscripted moment is measured against performance metrics. Anti-marketing isn't less strategic, it's more adaptive. Here's another detail. No one likes to talk about anti-marketing crowds out alternatives. Smaller companies without the resources to perform authenticity can't compete. Real transparency, slow, boring, unbranded doesn't trend. What wins is curated honesty with production value. The result is a market where sincerity must be performative to survive. And then there's the moral contradiction. Brands borrow the language of resistance while reinforcing the very systems they claim to oppose. They joke about capitalism while benefiting from it. They critique advertising while refining it. They sell rebellion as a lifestyle accessory safely contained within a checkout flow. Ask yourself this: if a brand truly hated advertising, why would it need to tell you so loudly? Why does rejection require repetition? Why does honesty need a campaign? The answer is simple and uncomfortable. Anti-marketing isn't about escaping manipulation, it's about upgrading it. This strategy works because it doesn't fight skepticism, it uses it. It turns your awareness into a lever, your intelligence into a tool. The more you believe you can't be fooled, the easier it becomes to guide you. And here's the final microhook that ties it together. The most effective advertising in the world no longer tries to convince you that a product is good. It convinces you that you are too smart to be advertised to. That's not transparency, that's precision. This isn't just a story about clever brands, it's a reflection of a broader cultural shift in how power, trust, and persuasion now operate. We live in an era where institutions are distrusted by default. Governments feel distant, corporations feel predatory, media feels compromised. In that environment, skepticism isn't rebellion anymore, it's common sense. Anti-marketing thrives precisely because of this climate. It doesn't try to restore trust in advertising. It bypasses the need for trust altogether. Instead of asking audiences to believe, it asks them to identify. The message isn't "this product is good," it's "you and I see the world the same way." And shared worldview is far more persuasive than any claim about quality. This reflects a deeper problem in modern consumer culture. Influence has shifted from facts to feelings, from arguments to alignment. People don't want to be convinced, they want to feel understood. Anti-marketing provides that feeling efficiently. It mirrors cynicism back to the audience and says you're right to be suspicious. That validation creates intimacy. Intimacy creates loyalty. But that loyalty comes at a cost. When brands position themselves as cultural allies, criticism starts to feel personal. Questioning the product feels like questioning the values attached to it. Consumers don't just defend what they buy, they defend what buying says about who they are. Commerce becomes identity work. This also reshapes accountability. If advertising is framed as a shared joke, responsibility dissolves. There's no clear moment where persuasion happens, no single claim to challenge. Influence becomes ambient everywhere and nowhere at once. And when influence is ambient resisting, it requires constant vigilance, which most people don't have the energy to maintain. Zoom out further, and anti-marketing reveals something unsettling about capitalism's adaptability. Systems don't collapse when they're criticized. They evolve. They absorb the language of resistance and turn it into fuel. Anti-marketing isn't outside capitalism, it's capitalism learning how to survive in a cynical age. The audience isn't passive in this process. Participation matters. Likes, shares, comments, and purchases all reinforce the strategy. Every time irony is rewarded with engagement, it becomes more valuable. Every time authenticity performs well, it gets replicated. The cycle continues not because people are naive, but because the system is responsive. So the uncomfortable question isn't whether brands are manipulating audiences. It's whether audiences are willing to admit how much they enjoy being manipulated, as long as it feels flattering, voluntary, and aligned with their self-image. Because once persuasion becomes identity opting out, stops being a consumer choice. It becomes a cultural one. In the end, anti-marketing didn't destroy advertising, it perfected it. By pretending to reject persuasion, brands found a way to make persuasion feel invisible. By mocking ads, they made advertising harder to recognize. And by insisting they weren't trying to sell anything, they created the most effective selling environment of all, one where resistance feels unnecessary. The real lesson isn't that brands are dishonest, it's that honesty itself became a strategy. Authenticity turned into a feature. Irony became a delivery system. And skepticism, the very instinct meant to protect audiences, was repurposed as the entry point. Anti-marketing teaches us a simple, uncomfortable truth: pretending not to influence people is often the most powerful form of influence. When selling feels like agreement and buying feels like self-expression, persuasion no longer needs to argue, it just needs to blend in. So the next time a brand apologizes for advertising, pause for a second. Ask why that apology needed a production budget. Ask why rejection required repetition. Ask why something that isn't an ad seems so determined to stay in your head. Because the most expensive ads today don't look like ads at all. They look like jokes, they sound like honesty, and they feel like your own idea. That's the punchline. Not that advertising lied to you, but that it convinced you it didn't need to anymore.